The Hundred Years' War is one of the most legendary wars to be ever fought, where it had 3 phases and was fought for 116 years in total, and so much could have happened as to change world history. Historically, France eventually defeated the English and retained their sovereignty, retaking Gascony and formally cementing their control over Normandy and Brittany. Meanwhile, England had developed as a separate kingdom, and the two drifted away from each other, despite starting out as basically the same kingdoms. Do you think that England would be better off if they won the 100 Years' War? The English population was several times smaller than that of France, and the economy had similar proportions, not only making this victory very hard to be achieved realistically, but also making it perhaps more difficult than winning itself for England to even keep these territories. Let me show you what I came up with. First up, some context explaining the lead up to the situation. England and France by 1337 were not as separate as some may think. England was ruled by a French-speaking nobility and monarchs basically starting at 1066, with Richard I of England ruling the English for 10 years in total, but in reality he only spent about 6 months in total in England itself. He was ruling the Angevin Empire, more on it later, where chronicles claim that he would have sold the English portion if he had found a buyer. This is because even England by 1337 had only a few holdings in France, like Gascony, but also Ponthieu, near Calais. Surprisingly, this French portion of the English kingdom was sometimes more profitable than the entirety of England. As England was basically formed by the Normans conquering the Isles, led by William the Conqueror in 1066, who was French, eventually the country became dominated by the French language in the nobility. This created the issue of the English kings technically being subjects of France, but also in practice independent. To explain this, I want to go back to the Angevin Empire, which was led by the House of Plantagenet, which directly got their name from Geoffrey as Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou. The Anjou was transformed into Angevin, thus deriving its name from a French county. Considering we are talking about the 12th and 13th centuries, it was not a unified country, but rather a patchwork of states that were gotten from political marriages, unions and conquests. For example, during the reign of Henry II, Normandy was inherited through his mother, Anjou and Maine were Henry's paternal lands, Gascony was gained through Henry's marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine in 1152, and this was one of the richest duchies in Europe at the time. Brittany had been part of the Angevin Empire due to Henry II's son Geoffrey, who had married the Duchess of Brittany. It was not centralized but rather a collection of semi-independent regions under one overlord. Most of these states had more autonomy than one could imagine. The problem is that these English lands in France were officially French, part of the French crown. This meant that England owed homage to France, or basically they had to pay for holding on to these territories. At this point, England was perhaps not wealthier than France, however the two were quite close. Regardless, England still had to pay money to France as homage for their French holdings, so these are the roots of the conflict. As such, a conflict of interest arose. Imagine making more money than your boss but still having to work for him. At one point this would result in a conflict. In the Anglo-French War of 1213 to 1214, the English tried to ally with the Holy Roman Empire and Flanders as to crush France. And although the war was very close, France managed to win the decisive Battle of Bouvines in 1214, leading to England to lose most of their lands in France, leaving them mainly with Gascony and Ponthieu. This is really important and I would use it later on for a point of divergence. Henry III would rule England after the collapse of the Angevin Empire, where he would attempt to regain lost territories, which failed miserably. In the Treaty of Paris in 1259, he would renounce his claims on Normandy and Anjou, while Gascony was reinstated, but officially as a vassal of France. Edward I would succeed him and focus more on Wales and Scotland, while his successor Edward II would be described later on as a weak king, while in France the Capetian dynasty was ruling strongly and improving. Edward II was eventually deposed by his French wife, who was also the daughter of the French King Philippe IV. Basically what happened is that Edward II was as incompetent as a ruler can get, losing a war to Scotland and being quite corrupt, unpopular and not supported by the nobles. His wife, the daughter of the French king, was sent to France to negotiate terms over Gascony. Isabella, however, allied with Roger Mortimer, where they raised a small army in Hainaut, then invaded England. Many nobles were fed up with Edward II and they joined this rebellion, eventually captured, imprisoned and potentially murdered him. Anyways, let that sink in. The daughter of the French king was having such an important role in English politics, being married to the English king and potentially putting French interests first. Still, Edward II was succeeded by his son Edward III, whose mother was Isabella, the daughter of the French king. Do you start to see the problem here? The English king now became a grandson of the French king. Then the Capetian dynasty died out in 1328, giving Edward III a direct and very legitimate claim over the French crown, which was pressed 9 years later, starting the 100 Years' War. So here is an interesting perspective. The English kings were basically French, originating from William the Conqueror of Normandy, which is in France. They spoke French mostly and the nobility was mostly French. Richard I of England did say that he cared mostly about his French codings, and most English kings neglected the English portion. So here is a really interesting way to look at the 100 Years' War, as rather than describing it as a war between England and France, it is more so a French civil war, fought between two French royal families. Further, officially England was still a vassal of France. Although they were mostly independent, de facto they were part of France and paying tribute to them, which furthers the weird perspective of seeing it as a civil war. Basically, the French royalty in Britain wanted to take back their ancestral holdings in France, mainly Anjou and Normandy. So this is how the war broke out, but I want to make some changes as to prior to the war, because in this period lies the way England can win the war, which is the narrative of this scenario. As I said earlier, the English by 1337 were not a match for the French in terms of population and economy, so even if they got lucky in winning some important battles, them holding on to France would become quite difficult. A figure like Joan of Arc could lead the French resistance, and due to the French wealth and population, such resistance may very well succeed. Even if it is the most realistic outcome that England wins over France, the two would be temporarily united under a personal union, and later on they would separate due to the resistance or other issues. However, if I am realistic, it would create a very boring video, as then we would mostly return to our timeline, but with an interesting side quest. I believe that in the Angevin Empire lies the key to England winning the war against France, more than a century later, but also perhaps most importantly, holding on to these territories. So what changes am I talking about? Earlier I mentioned that sometimes Gascony had a larger economy than the rest of England combined, and this was one of the wealthiest European provinces. Thus, I would suggest that England loses the Anglo-French War of 1213 to 1214 less decisively, where historically they lost everything but Gascony and Ponthieu, but if we get them to keep Normandy, Anjou and Maine, it could be really beneficial for them later on, perhaps Brittany as well, making England more wealthier in the 100 Years' War and France in a worse position. Talking about the Anglo-French War of 1213 to 1214, the most decisive battle was the Battle of Bouvines. Historically, England gathered allies in the Holy Roman Empire, including the Emperor Otto IV, and some minor HRE members were very committed, like Flanders, Brabant, Holland, Lorraine and Limburg, which all had reasons to hate France, as it is only natural that one does. When the war started, England went south, hoping to distract the French away from Paris, allowing their HRE allies to capture the city and make France sue for peace. The problem is that the French realized what was happening and consolidated their forces, rushing to defend their homeland, which surprised Otto IV by the speed of which France was acting. The following Battle of Bouvines is recognized as one of the most decisive medieval engagements, so turning it around would be tricky. Historically, the English and their coalition, which I would be simply calling the coalition for this section, were lacking in communication greatly. To keep it short, this basically allowed the French to defeat them in detail, meaning that they mostly defeated them individually with their larger armies, as the coalition almost never regrouped and fought together until it was too late. Another positive change we can make is for the coalition to take the initiative, as historically it was the French who chose the battlefield, where they had local support. France choosing the battlefield by positioning their army there and forced the coalition to engage was not a coincidence, as the French cavalry at the time was very effective. Thus here is a change I would like to make to fix all of these two issues. Instead of England going south to draw away the French army and the HRE to go towards Paris, both armies would now consolidate near Rouen, where they could fight slightly north of that, which terrain would be more unfavorable for the French cavalry, and winning there could open up the way to Paris, so I think that this makes sense. This I feel like is not unreasonable, as I'm suggesting that the battle takes place about 150 kilometers or under 100 miles away from its original location. With that, the armies were a bit more even, with 6,000 to 7,000 on the French side, while the coalition had 8,800 to 9,000 soldiers, so they had a slight advantage. We have maximized the odds for the coalition, if not winning here, to at least not suffer a major defeat, which is really important. This is because historically Otto I, the Holy Roman Emperor, was deposed as a result of these losses, while back in England, due to them losing the war, basically a civil war had started. As to keep it simple, the battle is deadly on both sides and more equal, so no clear winner would emerge. Pope Innocent III would come into the picture and mediate a truce, which was common at the time. In 1214, it was Pope Innocent III that assembled this alliance against France, so if the battle is a bit more indecisive, this truce could benefit England, and France is unlikely to go against the papal authority, as all of this was done before the Avignon papacy, which would greatly boost the narrative of the scenario being achieved. In the truce, England would have to lose Touraine and other territories, but they would get to keep Gascony, Maine and Normandy for the time being, while Britain is more indecisive, but I think it eventually drifts to the English influence. Finally, England would still pay homage to France for occupying these territories. As you can see, these terms are fairly minor of keeping the status quo, but with a minor English loss that still likely causes the internal troubles like they had historically, which is the First Barons' War of 1215 to 1217, where France landed in the mainland of England and actually almost got the entire country, but this is a topic for another video where France wins the 100 Years' War a century before it has even started. All of this would still happen here, but the English kingdom is mostly intact, not altered too much politically, and eventually Edward III would press his claims on the English throne. But in this alternate history, England is much stronger and wealthier, while France has taken a hit economically and politically. One way we can have England to win the 100 Years' War is for Edward III to simply become the King of France as well in 1328. After all, he was the legitimate successor, but the local French nobility went with the Valois dynasty instead, which later sparked the 100 Years' War. Having the French nobility be persuaded to side with Edward III, who now has a greater realm, thus preventing the entire war and giving England a total victory outright. Now this is very unrealistic to happen, but it's still a possibility. It is unrealistic because the Salic law could be invoked, where Edward III comes from Isabella, a female, so they could argue him not legitimate for this position. Still, via bribery and land promises, it is not impossible that they switch sides, but I know who is watching the video right now. You want to see war and I shall deliver on that. When the war does start, the English, like historically, would perform quite well against outnumbered French forces, where England would lose longbows to dominate the battlefields, and France had no real way to respond in the beginning. In this alternate history, the English would have a lot more land and resources, with Normandy being especially important, as it can produce a lot of food and is right across the English Channel, so England becomes wealthier than France, at least per capita, which would allow them to field larger armies than historically, plus potentially hire a lot more mercenaries. Now, this is the first phase of the 100 Years' War, called the Edwardian phase, and you may wonder why I'm glossing over it, rather than explaining it in detail and making some changes. The reason for that is because I don't think it would be beneficial for England to win the 100 Years' War in the Edwardian phase, and this is because of a Chinese rat. Let me explain. Even if we pull some strings and make England win 10 or 15 years after the war had started, which with the changes we have made so far, plus the English had the advantage in the beginning, which is not too unreasonable. The thing is that even if we assume that England wins here, the obvious problem would be the Black Death in 1347, which would see about half of their respective populations die out. For the French portion, it is especially important, as essentially they had created a feudal system, relying on peasants to work the lands, where they had fewer freedoms and were taxed quite a lot. With the Black Death killing about half of the French population historically, this system did collapse and caused plenty of issues. What matters for this scenario is that even if we make England somehow come out on top, then the Black Death would directly cause much unrest in France, that for England to keep the territory is borderline impossible, returning us to our history, and the 100 Years' War would later on continue. One thing that I find quite interesting is how Christian Europe reacted to the Black Death, where Christian values didn't prevent half of the continent from dying, and the peasants were wondering why God would bring such suffering. If France was conquered by England, the French peasants could see this plague as God punishing them for losing to England, thus making their resistance way stronger than the one of Joan of Arc historically and a century earlier. Overall, this would not achieve the narrative of the video, at least in my opinion, so in the Edwardian phase I would have something a lot more different to happen. England wouldn't win outright, but historically they grew in size at the expense of France, especially to the south. In this alternate history, England is larger going into the war, so they could have performed a lot better, and since historically they won the Edwardian phase, it can result in more lands for this alternate England. The Treaty of Bretigny in 1360 would have given the 100 Years' War a pause for 9 years, where the English would take what they did historically, plus they would get to keep their gains in France, that we made them achieve with the alternate Anglo-French War of 1213 to 1214, plus since England performed a lot better, I think that they would take slightly more land, like Touraine, which was part of their predecessor, the Angevin Empire. The fact is that this treaty is more so a truce. England wouldn't annex these territories outright, as they're technically still part of France. I mean, heck, even England is still technically a French vassal. Yes, the treaty did try to separate England and France, but the French king didn't recognize it, paving the way for the second phase, the Caroline War. The conflict wasn't fought about land, but rather which side would completely rule over the other, as we saw it in the First Baron War, where France almost took the entirety of England. So, after the Treaty of Brittany in 1360, we have this alternate map of Europe. England controls Normandy, Anjou, Maine, most of Aquitaine, Poitou, Calais, Touraine, Brittany, and some other minor territories. That's a far bigger powerhouse than they were historically, that basically surrounds France's coastline on the Atlantic Ocean, making it easy for England to control these territories and preventing France from building a large navy in the region, which is very important for England's security. Further, these lands that England would control in this alternate history are not just symbolic, but they are very important, as likely it at least doubles or perhaps triples the English economy and population, while these added lands would serve as tax bases, raising English revenue further and making them adopt more professional army. France, meanwhile, would be devastated, not just from military defeats and loss of land, but also from the Black Death and the Jacquerie Rebellion, which just shows how fragile the French feudalism system had become and how the entire system had collapsed. By 1369, the war would break out again, this time what is known as the Caroline phase, named after King Charles V of France. Historically in the war, Charles rebuilt France, recovered many lands and almost completely pushed the English back to the sea, leaving them with the fewest holdings in France in their history. But in this alternate timeline, England has more resources, stronger footholds in northern France, and all of this is at the expense of the French, who lack these resources themselves. This war was like a zero-sum game. Every English gain was at the expense of France, thus not only making England stronger, but France also weaker, so England having just about double their lands in France is a big deal for the Caroline phase. So, in 1369 the 100 Years' War would continue, as Edward III would restart his claim on the French crown, while France stops recognizing England's gains in Aquitaine as sovereign. Historically, it was France that managed to win so decisively, as I said earlier. The reason for that is that King Charles V of France was actually very competent. The French didn't have a counter for the English longbows just yet, so instead Charles V avoided taking battles where his foe would have the advantage and instead relied on Fabian's strategy, which is slowing down the enemy, attrition and scorched earth, giving France time to rebuild. Historically this worked, as England was very deep into hostile territories, but now England does control a lot more of France, which would minimize the impact of this decision by Charles V. This is because England can easily resupply Normandy, over which historically most of the Caroline phase was fought, so it being originally English could result in England to keep and expand the fortifications there, making France's strategy not work. Now, if you think that this is unrealistic for France to change their strategy so suddenly, I have a plausible way to explain how this could happen, and this is because of Bertrand du Guesclin. He was the mastermind behind this French strategy and was quite competent general at the time. The problem is that he originated from Brittany, which England would have never lost in this alternate history, not in the Anglo-French War of 1213 to 1214, not in the first phase of the war. For 2 or 3 centuries, Brittany would be firmly English, so we may have very well butterflied Bertrand du Guesclin from coming to power in France. Now yes, the circumstances in France were dire, so somebody would feel in this position, but if he sees warfare a bit differently, even though he could be a competent general, could result in this exact change of France's armies during the war. Further, I cannot stress how important mercenaries were at the time, and since England is wealthier per capita, they can pay more for mercenaries, preventing them from going over to France, which could snowball greatly. One more change I'd like to make is for England to ally with the Flemish once again, like they did prior. These states preferred to work with England and relied on their wool, but Flanders desired the return of the cities Aire-sur-Wallis and Saint-Omer, which were lost to King Philip II to France back in the year of 1212. Like in the Anglo-French War of 1213 to 1214, I can see Lorraine and Holland to also participate, while England could ally once more with the Holy Roman Empire, which would still despise France. Even if England manages to secure that these states do not oppose England and cease trade with France, this would still be very impactful, as France would be hurt from losing northern trade, which is from where most of their revenue came from. As I said earlier, Charles V was very competent at rebuilding France and delaying the English, but now how is he going to rebuild France with less taxation due to not holding out on Maine, Normandy and so on, but also with potentially less trade with the Dutch and the HRE? I think that France would be forced to increase taxes on their smaller than historically territories, just so they can fund the already stupidly expensive war. The French subjects are not going to like this at all, and may prefer England as an overlord, who would promise them less taxation. Basically, they would begin to see England as the lesser evil, hence why they could work with them, or simply refuse to help France. Either way would work. Cities to the north of France would switch allegiance, or at least not support France. So the French are now desperate, and England is advancing towards Paris, eager to end the war right here and right now. What I want to happen is for this war to end early. Slightly later I will tell you why. What we need to happen here is for France to get impatient, which I can see as really likely. Their subjects are rebelling over taxes and France is in a disadvantageous position, so they would inevitably lose if they drag on the war. As such, I can see the changes we have made so far to force the hand of Charles V of France to attempt a decisive battle so early into the war, because the more he waits, the more he is guaranteed to lose. The specifics of the battle would matter little, as likely we have created a fictional battle that doesn't exist historically. We don't even need for England to win this decisive battle for this scenario to work. What we need to happen is for Charles V of France to lose his life, which with the English longbows, one arrow shot landing could do the work, or instead England and their allies obliterate the French. It doesn't matter how Charles V would be killed in battle, but it matters what happens after that. Let us say that this battle takes place in the year of 1371, so 2 years after the 100 Years' War was restarted. Charles V would be succeeded by his son Charles VI, who was nicknamed the Mad, due to him being literally mentally ill and psychotic. Another problem is that he would be 3 years old in 1371. Historically, Charles V died in 1380, so Charles VI was 11 years old when he took hold of France. On the contrary, Edward III died in 1377, and his 10 years old of Richard II became the next monarch. Thus, in 1380 historically, this phase of the war was fought between two children, not even teenagers. Both had a regency council that was problematic, and the war was very expensive, hence why it was paused in 1389 with the Truce of Leiningen. Now, in this alternate history, it is very different. In the year of 1371, Charles V would be slain in battle, and Charles VI would succeed him at 3 years old. A regency council would be immediately formed, but here is a problem, which is that all the regents would want to take power for themselves, so let me tell you who they were. Historically, the regents were the Duke of Burgundy, Bourbon, Anjou and Berry. As Anjou would be in English hands for centuries at this point, the existence of Louis I of Anjou is but a flight away, leaving us with 3 people for the regency of the French king. John, Duke of Berry, is described as being corrupt and loving luxury, where on the battlefield he was not particularly strong, but he preferred diplomacy, which did help him keep his estates rich. Further, he is described as greedy and lacking of charisma, so this is not a great regent to put it simply. Philip the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, was the second regent, where he was very capable and strong, but this would likely backfire for France. He was married to Margaret of Flanders, from which Burgundy would eventually inherit these lands. As Flanders is now allied with England, Philip the Bold could be seen as a traitor, but the issue doesn't stop there. At the time he was one of the richest people due to his control over Flanders and managed to make Burgundy a sort of independent state. To put it simply, he has little reason to help France out, as he is either distrusted or may decide to use the French defeat as to alleviate the status of Burgundy to a kingdom rather than a duchy. Finally, Louis II, Duke of Bourbon, would be the final regent of Charles VI, and he was very loyal to the French crown. He was conservative, stable and not greedy or corrupt, while he was also a brave knight. So he is the perfect candidate to influence Charles VI, but the problem is that historically nobody really cared about him, as he was by far the weakest of the men I just mentioned so far, and was often sidelined, where historically he mostly followed Philip the Bold, Duke of Burgundy's decisions. To summarize, 2 of the 3 regions would have other motives for themselves, rather than to help out France, while the only person that wanted to help France, the Duke of Bourbon, was insignificant, so the future of France is definitely bleak, not to speak that they are led by a 3-year-old child that later would become mentally ill. Historically, the Duke of Anjou was also a regent, but I mentioned here why this would not be the case. And while the Duke of Anjou was very incompetent, he balanced the power between the 3 other dukes. Here this is not the case, and likely Burgundy has the most influence. Philip the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, would begin to influence France, and he might shift his strategy and see England as a more useful ally, especially since England would control trade routes vital to the Flemish cities, which is where Philip the Bold made most of his money and from where later on he would inherit Flanders. Basically, I can see the strategy of Burgundy to be as following: sabotage France and allow England to win, then become a sort of a vassal of England. The Burgundians could expect England to not keep a hold of France, so when they inevitably collapse, according to the point of view of Burgundy, the Burgundians would switch sides and decisively rule all of France. So I hope that you're starting to see why killing Charles V in battle would be so impactful, while Edward III would still be alive and has 5 more years to live, which is easily enough to finish the conflict, with France being so divided, where I can even see a civil war there to erupt. Finally, England would win the war in 1375, and Edward III would be crowned as the King of France, ending the 100 Years' War, but the hostilities are not over, in fact they're just the beginning. So England has won, and these are the borders. I mentioned that not all is good and well, starting with Burgundy, where they would be a rebellious vassal right off the bat, and likely continue to do so for a while, even more so later on as they expand into the lowlands. For England, the main problem would be the death of Edward III and the succession of his son Richard II, who would be 10 years old when he would inherit such a large country after a devastating war, so a regency council would absolutely be established. John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, would be Richard's uncle, and he was fairly competent and wealthy, which is helpful. The problem is that historically he was very unpopular, due to him being too soft on France. But in this alternate history, since England has won the war, his popularity I think would be normalized. I would go back to the Duke of Lancaster a bit later on. Thomas of Woodstock, Duke of Gloucester, was also an uncle of Richard during the Regency period, and he was also strong and ambitious, but later on he clashed with Richard and the two became enemies, so he is not the perfect fit for the narrative of the video, but regardless it would not be a problem now. Historically, the Count of Nobles and the Commons, which is the Parliament, were involved in the Regency, mostly due to the money and how England was broke economically, but here in this alternate history, England would win the war and would have retained plenty of profitable lands from France for centuries. So we can likely see John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, to be the main individual that would rule on behalf of Richard II, which I believe would be positive changes for the United Kingdoms of England and France. Sure, they may be a peasant revolt like the one historically in 1381, but historically it was sparked due to high taxes and a never-ending war. Here, perhaps neither of this is the case, but French peasants can revolt instead of the English. Regardless, Richard II was only 14 years old, and historically he showed courage by crushing these revolts. As England and Richard II would be way stronger as a whole, the Parliament may not strip him from power in 1386, which down the line would lead to more conflicts. If you're optimistic, Richard II would become a strong ruler, which while positive would have a huge butterfly effect. In 1399, Henry Bolingbroke, the son of John of Gaunt, the uncle and the most prominent regent of Richard, historically returned from his exile and overthrew Richard II, giving birth to the Lancaster dynasty, all of which could be butterflied away here. Further, this could also butterfly away the War of the Roses, which was fought between the two branches of the House of Plantagenet, the Lancasters and the Yorks. Historically, it was caused due to the loss of the 100 Years' War, the weak rule of Henry VI and other English kings, and economic and social decline, all of which I think would be butterflied here as well, so the kings of England and by extension France would later on become people we have never heard of, due to the House of Plantagenet surviving and ruling these kingdoms. This is further butterflied away, as historically the Tudors came to power after the collapse of the Lancasters and the Yorks in the War of the Roses, so eventually they got to rule England, and the most prominent leader would be Henry VIII, and I know that you have seen this guy. All of this simply never happens here, so the butterfly effects are, to put it simply, huge and unpredictable. Another huge butterfly effect would be the Avignon Papacy, where basically the Papal States were led from Avignon in France instead of Rome. At one point this created a huge issue, where there were 3 popes in total, one in Avignon, one in Rome, and one that was supposed to replace them both. In this alternate history, England would conquer France somewhere in the 1370s, when the Avignon Papacy was still ongoing. There, England would have 2 options: either they continue this practice, which later results in the Western Schism and loss of prestige for England and the Pope, with the latter reason being added to why the Protestants wanted reforms and the end of church corruption. I honestly think that the most likely option is for England to end the Avignon Papacy sooner, which immediately eases tensions and gets England some initial prestige, helping them consolidate France more smoothly. This can be easily achieved after the death of Pope Gregory XI in 1378, where England would back the Pope based in Rome, and so would the rest of the Catholics, so the candidate of the Avignon Papacy would never get traction, as historically it was only France that supported him, and the French would not exist here. Thus, this creates a strong Catholic unity down the line, as these countries are less fragmented and polarized, and the Protestant Reformation would be pushed back slightly, with the Catholic Church not embarrassing itself by having 3 popes at the same time, all hostile to each other. With that, I want to tell you that what happens after this point is pure fiction, as there is no way to reliably know. Literally all of the kings of France and England would be different from the ones we had historically, and people we don't know about would later on be ruling the United Kingdom of France and England, so to put it simply, anything could happen. In the late medieval era, some prominent decisions were made by the monarchs, and since we cannot know the monarchs in detail here, we cannot know any of the specifics, politics, wars, and so on. For all we know, there could be a weak monarch that collapses the entire union, which I would admit is definitely the most likely option, but then this video is boring, as we return to our history, and boohoo, let's make it interesting, even though it is unrealistic. Now, I chose this point of divergence on purpose, as in the third phase of the war, England had become more separate than France, and the English king started to speak English as either a first or a second language. Thus, if England won in the third phase of the war, they would likely attempt to try to convert the much larger France, while if they won the first phase, they would lose their holdings due to the Black Death. As such, the second phase I think is the best way to create a lasting union. Assuming that the country hasn't blown up immediately after being created, the French-speaking monarchs of England would have regained France. Thus, they would begin to care more about France than England itself, similarly to how they did during the Angevin Empire. The goal of the English monarchs was always to regain France and through it, which I mentioned extensively before how this war was more so a French civil war, regarding which house would rule England and France. It was only after the English being defeated in the 100 Years' War where they became very separate. So what does this matter for our scenario? Surprisingly, what has happened is that France would own England, not the other way around. The United Kingdoms of France and England would become a lot more French, be ruled by a French nobility and French-speaking monarchs. So essentially it's like France conquering England. This would be the practical outcome. Thus, this country would not behave like England historically in terms of colonization and later build-up of navy, but rather it would behave more like France historically, engaging in the Italian wars and seeking to expand into the HRE, especially up to the Rhine River. An immediate change this results in is that this kingdom is less focused on conquering Ireland and Scotland, due to the English being more focused on France. An immediate change I can see happening is that in 1396 the United Kingdoms of France and England would participate in the Battle of Nicopolis. Historically, it was fought against the Ottomans, mainly by the Hungarians and French, and other smaller coalition forces. Now, in this alternate history, I can see the English portion to also participate on the side of France, so we would see longbow actions in northern Bulgaria fighting against the Ottomans. You know, I always make these videos about myself, excuse me about that. Anyways, this could prove to be significant. Historically, the Christians had to pick up the Swags and send forces against the Ottomans, while France and Britain couldn't participate due to their ongoing wars, which ended in 1453. Now I had it end in 1375, so almost 8 years sooner than historically, and this is a big deal. This means that both England and France can send a lot sooner forces to crusade against the Ottomans, while historically they didn't want to do that because they were actively fighting in war and needed these forces elsewhere. Thus, in this alternate history, France would send a lot more soldiers, and England sends longbows and knights, increasing the odds of a Christian victory. The thing is that the Ottomans had basically trapped the Christians at Nicopolis, so they likely still crush the Crusaders and perhaps suffer more losses. Subscribe to the channel if you want to see a video of this unknown crusade, succeeding almost 50 years sooner before the famous one at Varna in 1444. So the United Kingdoms would still lose, which could cause some internal issues, but I think it would be mostly resolved. This is due to the English Parliament over France, and the fact that England had far better administration laws, which is now passed on to France, making them way stronger as well. Speaking of the English Parliament, since the French nobles would reject this type of proto-constitutional monarchy, I can see it to not be applied to the French portion, which creates an absolute mess of a country, as the United Kingdom of England and France are basically a personal union of the kingdoms of England and France individually. Different laws would apply to different realms of the United Kingdoms. Basically, the English portion would have a constitutional monarchy, and the French portion would be an absolute monarchy, but the monarch is all the same. He just has different powers depending on which part of the realm he is in, which creates an administrative nightmare in the beginning. Regardless to how the state looks internally, think of it like France has conquered England, rather than vice versa, which I know is weird, but it's the reality. In fact, it may be the English language that is the one to be suppressed in courts and government. Something really interesting to consider is that the English language may be completely gone in this alternate history. This is because France today kind of wasn't meant to be a country, and there are many dialects slash separate languages influenced by French, like Occitan and Breton. I can see English, which is even today very much so influenced by French, to become more similar to French itself, eventually being a funny dialect. Now that I have covered the internal situation of the United Kingdoms, let me cover the interesting bits, like wars and colonization. Who would be the enemies of the United Kingdom of England and France? Well, the Holy Roman Empire is an obvious one, as the two would have conflicts of interest in the bordering territories, but also Provence, basically in Italy as well. Originally, the HRE worked with England several times against France, but now as England basically becomes France 2.0, their rivalry would continue, just France is ruled by French-speaking English kings and nobles. Now, does Spain become an ally of the United Kingdom or would they become enemies? Well, historically they were very friendly towards France, so you may assume that this would be the case here as well, which is possible, but I think it's way less likely. Let me explain. The only reason why Spain and France became friendly was because of the Castilian Civil War, which coincided with the first phase of the 100 Years' War, and I had not talked about it until now. Basically, England supported Peter, while France supported Henry of Trastamara. Historically, the pro-French candidate won this war, which is Henry II, so this paved the way for their good relations and sometimes even alliances. Now in this alternate history, if we want Castile to remain allied with the United Kingdom, perhaps it has to be the English candidate, which is Peter, to secure the Castilian throne instead. As this Castilian Civil War was brutal, coinciding with the Black Death and the Edwardian phase, it would be tricky to be achieved, but remember that my point of divergence is the Angevin Empire simply losing less in their war against France in 1214. Well, this did snowball greatly for England's favor down the line, where they won the Edwardian phase more decisively than historically, so I can see them to help Peter come to power in Castile. Contrary, if this never happens, England could instead ally with Navarre and Portugal as to balance out Castile and Aragon. Furthermore, as France did historically temporarily ally with the Ottomans, I can see the United Kingdoms here to do so ally with Morocco and Granada, as Castile and Aragon would be their rivals. So, if this is the case, England winning the 100 Years' War not only makes England a French vassal, but also prevents the Reconquista. Clearly, as you can see, the possibilities would be endless, but I want to go down with Castile drifting towards the United Kingdom, as I think it would result in a more interesting scenario. If this is the case, Portugal and England may never ally, but something else is more interesting. Aragon had been more focused on Mediterranean trade, but with this powerful country on their doorstep that has also allied with Castile, they're basically encircled by the United Kingdoms and Castile, thus pushing Aragon away from them and likely towards the Holy Roman Empire. What this would result in is that Castile and Aragon would be enemies, and thus them uniting to form Spain is borderline impossible in this alternate history. If Portugal does decide to join the Anglo-French alliance, then Spain could be formed by Castile and Portugal uniting, which would later on have a shared colonial empire. So again, the possibilities are simply endless. For now, I would assume that the alliances would look like this, so Western Europe is much more divided and are neglecting the Ottoman incursions into Europe, likely making the Crusade of Varna fail as well, like historically, despite England and France being in a stronger position. Going back to the United Kingdom of England and France, I want to touch upon Burgundy. In the same way with how England was technically a vassal of France but still fought them, Burgundy would be sort of a vassal to England but still fight them. Earlier I mentioned how Philip the Bold, the Duke of Burgundy, had become quite rich and powerful, so his successors would inherit the lowlands and Burgundy would become a very strong vassal of the United Kingdom of England and France, which could later on challenge their rule and attempt to break the personal union. I can for sure see Burgundy to fight a couple of wars against the United Kingdoms, where there would be plenty of conflicts of interest. Either Burgundy would come out on top and secure independence, plus a lot of territory, if not all of France as well, or they would be defeated by the English and French. The problem is that the Holy Roman Empire is likely to get involved, which would drag Iberia into the conflict, allowing the Ottomans to do whatever they want in Eastern Europe, with this conflict preoccupying the European great powers to the west. As you can see, I think that this world would see way more wars than historically, with the existence of Burgundy, and further the Burgundian succession crisis could still happen, sparking another similar conflict, allowing for the Ottomans to rise even more, and I think that they would be stronger than historically. Of course, I cannot predict any of this, so let me cover something that I think is easier to understand. I think that England could remain Catholic, as the French portion effectively would throw over the English portion, and as France would remain Catholic like they are today, they could push for England to do the same. The problem is that this likely causes a civil war in the United Kingdom of England and France. I can totally see the English to become Protestant, just so they can differentiate themselves from the Catholic French. If this were to happen, then the Union staying together would become quite difficult due to the matters of religion. I hope that this entire video proves that even if England had gotten lucky and won the 100 Years' War, then this union actually lasting would be very difficult. Dare I say it, impossible. Yet I tried to keep it together for as long as possible. Finally, I want to cover New World exploration and colonization. As I said earlier, this union is more so an extension of France, and the French historically got very late into the whole colonization game. I can see the United Kingdom of England and France to become quite similar to the Holy Roman Empire. Instead of exploring for some in the beginning useless colonies, they would instead build large armies in Europe and fight each other. So the United Kingdoms wouldn't have any meaningful colonies, for the same reasons that the Holy Roman Empire didn't have any historically. Now, Castile and Portugal sailing the New World could be less incentivized than historically due to all of the wars on their doorstep and the general instability of the region, so I cannot predict what colonies the United Kingdoms of England and France would precisely get. I can only say that colonization as a whole would start slightly later than historically and less intensively. Overall, are England and France better off? Well, for England, I would argue absolutely not. The English language is undoubtedly altered in this alternate history, and their monarchs wouldn't be interested so much in conquering Ireland and Scotland, as instead they would be more interested on the French portion. Now, is France ironically doing better off with England defeating them in the 100 Years' War? Well, I would argue overwhelmingly yes, as they would benefit from the far superior English administration and institutions, so France would become more centralized and likely wealthier by somewhat exploiting the English. Both countries, however, I can see them to eventually have less colonies than historically. Now, I would admit that I went into this scenario thinking that the United Kingdom of England and France would have some great impact, but what I outlined is pretty minor, still potentially Spain not forming or being altered, colonization starting later on and not so intensely, and the Ottomans having free reign over Eastern Europe are some great changes that could happen here. Now, earlier I mentioned how the United Kingdom could have allied with the Muslims in Iberia and thus prevented the Reconquista, so I think that you should check out this video where Morocco and Granada managed to restore Al-Andalus, which greatly ties with this alternate history, as there the English also won the 100 Years' War, so you can see how this scenario would continue down south in Iberia. Thank you for watching and I hope to see you there. Goodbye.